The way these Dean's Forums work, for those of you who are not familiar with them, I know most of you are, they are sessions in which we invite freshmen through doctoral students, we invite faculty from the journalism school, the communication school, and elsewhere on campus. We invite staff and faculty from around campus, and some visitors come too, and today we're privileged to have some wonderful visitors here too. We're going to talk for about an hour, and then I always try to end these sessions at 1 o'clock sharp because people have to go to classes. But we are going to have a book signing. Can somebody show where the books are back there at Geo? So the book we're going to be talking about today, George Soros's Age of Fallibility, Consequences of the War on Terror, is what we're going to really be talking about. It is really a terrific privilege to have George Soros with us today. I think everybody here knows your history, and so I won't spend any time on it other than to say that there are people here who are Hungarian that are particularly proud of that heritage and connection. And you survived, of course, the Nazis and also the communists. Been a phenomenally successful investor, and I think one of the world's most innovative philanthropists, and done great work throughout the world. And on top of that, you have become a public intellectual, and it's really in that last capacity and in connection with this book, which is not exactly a book tour, we agreed, because you're going back quickly to get back to the United Nations to meet with various people there, but then in and out. But it is a book tour as well, this very important book. And the way we thought we would structure the discussion today is to have Manuel, two of our leading faculty members, comment for a few minutes about the book. Manuel Castells, who is, of course, the Wallis Annenberg Chair in Technology and Society, and perhaps the world's foremost authority on the integration of technology and its social impacts. And then Bob Scheer, who is a columnist and writer, editor of Truth Dig, who has been a major force for so many years. Each of them is going to start with some comments, and then we're going to come to George Soros. And I want to say to people who are rhetoric scholars in the room that part of where I hope we'll go during this hour is to talk about rhetoric, something that is very much at the core of this book, and I think it's fair to say an issue that Mr. Soros is very interested in exploring, continuing that intellectual exploration. With that, Manuel.
Thank you. Well, to share a venue with George Soros is always intellectually interesting and personally engaging. He is, in reality, one of the most fascinating personalities of our time. His goal, as he says, is and has been to make the world a better place. Of course, many people share this project and this view. But what happens is that, according to George Soros, to make it possible, to be able to make the world a better place on the action of one individual, three conditions are necessary. First, to have an appropriate conceptual framework. You see, students, it's important, conceptual framework. Second, to have a firm set of ethical and political values. And again, many people have these two conditions, but there is one third condition that is also required, according to George Soros, in his own words, and I have made a lot of money. So it's the combination of these three components that made him unique. But we are not here to talk about George Soros, but about his latest book. It's a book that I strongly and sincerely recommend to read, particularly to the only ones who have time to read, that is the students. It's a very intellectual book that elaborates and refines the notion of open society originally proposed by Karl Popper. And it places itself in the epistemological realm of reflexivity, a realm which I personally share because it cuts across the impossible dichotomy between naive rationalism that we inherited from the Enlightenment and the dissolution of understanding that is proposed by postmodernism, reducing everything to narratives. Everything is subjective. So between naive objectivity and pure subjectivity, there is reflexivity. And that, I think, is a fundamental epistemological principle. The book roots itself in the teachings, the original teachings of Karl Popper, but also has all kind of interesting developments into current cognitive theory, not rhetoric, but cognitive theory, which is, I would say, a deeper level of understanding, actually using, among others, works of my close colleagues George Lakoff and Antonio Damasio, therefore readings that are very familiar to our doctoral students here, so they should be able to connect directly. This theoretical approach is also developed in operational schemes of analysis, with real-life explanations about important phenomena. And a particularly useful one is George Soros' model of far from equilibrium situations, which is really what dominates our life and our world nowadays in almost every aspect, instead of the equilibrium assumption, for instance, from neoclassical economics. How useful is this operational model of far from equilibrium situations? Well, many people say often, if in answer to a question, if I knew it, I would make a lot of money. So George Soros knew it and made it a lot of money. In helping to engage the dialogue, I will simply ask George Soros 3 questions of different nature, directly taken from the writings in this book. First one, what is exactly a fertile fallacy, and why is it so important in our understanding of reality? And to provide you very quickly a context for this question, otherwise it becomes too abstract, I just read a short paragraph. I call the separation of thinking and reality a fertile fallacy. I contend that all cultures are built on fertile fallacies. They are fertile because they flourish and produce positive results before their deficiencies are discovered. They are fallacies because our understanding of reality is inherently imperfect. It follows from our fallibility that social arrangements cannot be based solely on knowledge or reason. They must also incorporate the accumulated biases of the participants. The collection of biases is commonly described as culture. That is the basis on which I claim that all cultures are built on fertile fallacies. This is powerful stuff. So I think we should discuss that. Second, I said different nature, starting with the deep theoretical question, because this book is very theoretical as well as then very political. Second question of a different nature. Reading a strong statement in page 16, the main obstacle to a stable and just world order is the United States. It is no longer a question of removing President Bush from the White House. A more profound rethinking of America's role in the world is involved. So, Mr. Soros, what is wrong with the American society beyond neocons? What is the connection between the feel-good society, as you put it, and the role of America in the world? Is this a fallacy flying over us? What is this?
I think if we can't control this, we should turn off the sound. I don't know what to. Okay, good.
So what is the connection between the feel-good society, as you put it, and the role of America in the world? And third question. You say that, you write, that many people blame the media for the current state of affairs, but the media merely serves the market. Is it so? Simply the media follow the audience taste? Is Fox just following the audience? But you also say, 2 pages later, that the public has no alternative source of information. In that context, what is the importance you give to the emergence of internet, of blogs, of alternative means of communication that are autonomous vis-a-vis mainstream media? And I could go on, so that's why this book is so interesting, but I think we are here to listen to George Soros, not to our questions.
Bob, should we hear from George first before you comment, or do you want to maybe comment on these 3 questions? Or are you ready?
I don't have any questions, so you can comment on them when I'm done.
Okay.
I just want to, before people get scared off, I want to just say, this is a book you could read in one night, I know, because I read it last night. And and it's an incredible read. It's basically two essays. One opening one up to philosophical questions that many of us have buried. I know I haven't thought about Popper since I was an undergraduate. And the whole idea, basically it's a tribute to secular thought and secular life at a time when it's under attack. That there are things that we have to figure out, including we have to deal with our own mortality, ascribe meaning to our life, figure out how we make decisions. And it's a very important philosophical inquiry, I think, the first half. And the second is the application of this to our current impasse, the role of the United States in the world, and what we can do about it and saving our democracy. What it is not is a book about how to make money. It's not a how-to book about how to get wealthy. It's a how-to book about how to save democracy, so I don't want to disappoint anyone. If the latter is your interest, it's a very good buy and a good read. And I think there's a few provocative things that in the book that I would like to deal with. One is we have this very simplistic idea now that our problem has to do with Islamofascism, and that basically we are aggrieved by people who come from primitive societies with primitive religions who have not tasted the good life, and therefore they are threatened by it and our freedom and our success and prosperity. This book actually asserts a much more provocative view. It goes back, I think, the last person I heard express it as well, I thought was Erich Fromm, An Escape from Freedom, which is that basically democracy is a rather fragile system, the open society of freedom. It can be besieged from within, and that the examples in Mr. Soros' own personal experience, obviously Germany, which conquered his native Hungary, was the most advanced society in the world. The best education, the best music, the best science, the smartest people, and actually fairly good relations among its own people, and yet committed the greatest barbarism of the modern period. And after all, was responsible for the Holocaust, not the Arabs of Palestine, as sometimes is implied. And so the question then, and then the Soviets who came in, and the second source of tyranny, claimed to be advancing very new ideas, and were not at all given to religious primitivism, and claimed to be extending human freedom, and of course made a horror of it. So the question that is raised in this book is how do bad things happen in good societies? And it departs from this very simplistic notion that our enemy is out there, and if we could just convert them. And the question I wanted to raise, because it goes to another point in the book, how do we perceive reality? How many people here know anything about Mohammad Mossadegh? Iran. Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran. Anybody show of hands? Okay, Mossadegh, sorry. Sure. Okay, 4 people, 5 people. All right, right now we're thinking about waging war against Iran. We're worried about who they are, where do they come from, and so forth. And I thought the most compelling thing for a School of Communications in this book is to challenge how do we perceive reality. We know that at a key point in the State Department, there were 7 people who knew Farsi, probably 10 who knew classical Arabic, so forth. This book basically challenges the way we think about social issues and the world. And so here we have all the news filled with stuff about Iran. Should they have a bomb? What's driving them? Is it nationalism, religion, blah, 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 blah. And we haven't got the most simplistic, superficial understanding of their history or our role in it. The fact that our CIA under Kermit Roosevelt overthrew the last nationalist, secular, popular leader of Iran in 1953, that we changed fundamentally the course of that country, that things have grown out of it, and so forth. So I guess the question, if I'm going to put one question, was you make a very important charge here. You say the danger to this country is not the so-called war on terror, which you object to the label, but you say the people who are advancing this notion of a war on terror. I don't have the exact, maybe I do have that quote, but I thought it was, he makes me so nervous because he's so well prepared, and I'm always winging it, but there is a quote in which you very clearly say the whole problem is in framing this as a war, instead of dealing with it clinically and what is the problem, and that the response to the so-called war is the real danger to our society. So maybe that would be the question. How do you defend that?
But I really appreciate your comments. It's exactly the kind of discussion that I'm hoping to generate by writing this book. So it's tremendous for me to get a response from readers. So I just want to express my appreciation. Now, you posed some really difficult questions. If I could answer it in 5 minutes, I would not have written the book.
Read the book.
But let me try. And I think actually the third question is the easiest one that I can answer in 2 minutes, because the media play a dual role. Media is a business, and it caters to the market. Mm-hmm. But media is also one of the fundamental institutions of an open democratic society. So there are these dual functions. So journalists, media people, let's say, have a professional obligation to expose things as they see it and generate debate and report and investigative journalism, etc. Transparency is one of the requirements for a well-functioning open society, and that's what the media is supposed to ensure. So you've got an institutional role and you've got a business role. And those two roles don't mesh. There is a conflict between them. And basically, the media are run as a business, and the institutional role has eroded as the business interests have come to the fore. And that's the problem that we confront. It's an institutional problem. And so we are reduced to basically, I would say, 2.5 newspapers. I include the Los Angeles Times as a half a newspaper.
So much for Michael Parker.
I have high respect for the LA Times. But those three institutions are also beleaguered because they are businesses. Mm-hmm. And even the New York Times is under pressure from the shareholders. And that interferes with their institutional role. And of course, in the other media, you've got NPR that's doing a good job, and it's important. In television, I think the PBS has pretty well been politicized and has been greatly endangered. So now with the technological changes that are occurring, and maybe the internet and the blogosphere will actually replace the official media, perhaps. But its initial effect is actually to endanger the business model of the newspapers. So that is what makes that crisis, I think, much more acute than it would be otherwise. So that's a simple answer, I think. Now, when it comes to fertile fallacy and what's wrong with America, I mean, that really does go to the basic philosophy, and you have to start with the concept of reflexivity, which is basically, the problem of understanding reality. When you are yourself a participant in the reality that you are trying to understand. then you've got these dual functions, similar to what I was talking about in the media. One function is to gain knowledge on the basis of on the basis of which you can make decisions, and the other one is actually to make an impact. And the two functions again interfere with each other, because your understanding of reality is part of reality. You are part of reality. And so what you think actually changes what you think about. And therefore, in trying to gain knowledge, you're shooting at a moving target. Because not only what you think, but what the other fellow thinks, what all the other people in the world think, what they are doing, it all changes the reality that you're seeking to understand. So that is what renders our understanding inherently imperfect, as a result of which we basically can't base our decisions on knowledge. We have to make a guess. We have to apply our biases, our either hardwired or soft-wired prejudices and reactions to making our decisions. So therefore our decisions are not rational in the sense of being based on knowledge. That's an impossibility. And actually the separation in trying to gain knowledge, our philosophers, Western philosophy, separated the mind from reality. Somehow posited it as something that's outside reality, looking in. And that actually was a very fertile fallacy. It's a fallacy. It's the Enlightenment fallacy. But it's been very fertile, because as a result, we have in fact been able to acquire an awful lot of knowledge. It's been particularly effective in the field of natural science, because there what we think actually doesn't change what you're thinking about. Now, there is an uncertainty principle in natural science as well, the famous Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. But there is an additional, what you might call a social uncertainty principle that you have to recognize, because when Heisenberg put forward his uncertainty principle, it didn't change the behavior of the particles or waves or whatever, the quanta that he was making that generalization about. But when, let's say, Karl Marx or Karl Rove puts forward a certain theory about human affairs, that actually changes the way people behave and how events evolve. So that's the let's say the quandary that the human condition.
So
now,
how George Soros' theory changes human affairs?
Well, hopefully we will understand it a little better, which is understanding that we can't, for instance, predict with certainty the outcome of our actions. It pushes you to critical thinking. And see, when you act, you have to base yourself on some belief. You can't do without belief. But if you are aware that you may be wrong, I think you are ahead of the game. You are closer to reality. This was the sort of the main message that Karl Popper wanted to convey. He said, we may be wrong. And I take it a little further, but it's a kind of a kind of a challenge or almost a joke, paradox, because I say that we are bound to be wrong. Not right away, but if you find something that works, then you tend to overstay your welcome. You put more and more weight on that great insight, you see, so that eventually you push it too far and it becomes wrong. But it doesn't mean that it wasn't right at the beginning, and also that it hasn't produced very positive results, like, for instance, the Enlightenment. Now, one of the areas I think we have pushed it too far is actually in social science, where the natural science has been so successful that we try to use the same methods and same expectations as we had about natural science to social science. So in 19th century science, you expected to be able to predict the future, deterministic. You had to come with deterministic ideas. That's why Karl Marx, let's say, had this theory of history. And that's how actually economic theory developed. And I think, as I argue in the book, that mainstream economics is as biased in a certain way as, let's say, Marxist theory.
Did you want to comment on the last of the
No. So then the point about social affairs, that you can actually change reality by the way you deal with it. And so truth, if you'd say truth, equate truth with a true representation of reality, maybe isn't as important as one would think. That if you can manipulate the truth, or if you can manipulate reality, then why should you be so concerned about the truth? And in actual fact, the American public is not so concerned with the truth. I mean, we have been lied to, we've been misled, but we haven't really taken that very seriously. In other words, it hasn't upset us as much as it ought to. Now, why should it upset us? I think there is a very good reason why it should. Because if people manipulate reality, the outcome will not correspond to their expectations. And so you have unintended adverse consequences. And when you look at the war on terror, it's the quintessential demonstration, you see, how the Bush administration, I don't want to talk only about President Bush because I think Vice President Cheney played an even bigger role than Bush in sort of proposing the war on terror and pushing the war on terror. But they were very successful in getting the American public to accept the war on terror as the obvious, natural, indispensable way of responding to the terrorist attack. Now, I call it a false metaphor, which is actually the reverse of a fertile fallacy. You know? And when you look at what it has accomplished, and you look at the position of the United States on September 11, 2001, when we were unquestionably the leaders of the world, and we set the agenda for the world, and you look at it today, when our ability to project power has been compromised because we have actually projected our power, and our power is now sort of caught in a quagmire in Iraq, so we can't project it elsewhere. And anything that we propose is treated with the utmost suspicion and objections. And we now have other players who can set the agenda. So a tremendous deterioration in our position in the world. And I think that the idea that was motivating the Bush administration was to assert American power and to use our military power more effectively than we had in the past. This was, articulated by them. And the effect has been the opposite. So that's why it's very important to have a proper understanding of reality. And when President Bush is telling us that our will is being tested in the streets of Baghdad, it's not our will. It's our understanding of reality that is being tested. So the more we persist, the bigger hole we are digging for ourselves.
Let's open this up to people in the audience. And one of the topics that we talked about, I'd love to have one or two people comment on this, is that much of your book is about the power and the implications of using the phrase of the war on terror and all that flows from it. But we were saying before we started, you're suggesting maybe there's some principle that exists where one group uses a phrase and then the other group has to somehow respond in kind. So we use it and then Iran has to respond the same way, or vice versa.
We've just thrown so much put so much on the table that maybe we should get some reaction, and then, that's a new idea that I'm about to develop.
So before we leave today, we want to touch on that idea. Can we get questions? And by the way, students are more than... Tom, did you want to make a comment?
I was thinking last week, Colin Powell, after a long silence, decided to say we're losing moral authority. Does that mark a change in public thinking? And then more generally, how do you spot changes in public thinking, be they in the markets or politics, that get articulated through discourse?
Well, I think it's a very healthy development. I think it's a very important development because, where we are today is that we realize that going into Iraq was a mistake. But we haven't yet come to question the concept of the war on terror and the idea that, the right way is to use alternative methods of interrogation. And that actually is a specific counterproductive aspect of the war on terror, because when you basically, what we find abhorrent in the terrorists is that they kill innocent people for political goals. Now, when we are waging war on terror, we create innocent victims also. And therefore, we are perceived in the same light as we perceive the terrorists. This is something that's difficult for us to understand because we are basically decent people. So how could we be doing it? But we're actually doing it, and we are actually perceived like that. So I think that the 4 Republican senators, backed by Colin Powell, now repudiating that aspect, I think is a very important and very healthy development.
And maybe you could identify yourself.
My name is Jeff Newman. I'm with the State of California Technology-Based Economic Development. The question is in regard to fertile fallacies. So right now we're stuck in a false metaphor which has a cul-de-sac, which we're kind of spinning around in. So the fertile fallacies that those of us who would like to act more reflexively should engage in creating or fostering. What do you see as
Something fertile.
Yeah.
Well, you're basically asking, what should America's role in the world be? What should be our mission as distinct from waging war on terror, which is counterproductive and false mission. I propose in the book, and of course I do it because I believe in it, that if we are the leaders of the world, we have a unique responsibility to be concerned with the with concerns or issues which are common to humanity and which need international cooperation to deal with, because we have a world order based on the sovereignty of states. So states generally pursue their own interests and not the common interest. If you are going to be the leader of this world order, then you have this additional responsibility of actually caring about and leading the world in cooperative action to solve the pressing problems. And I identify in the book 3 of them: global warming, nuclear proliferation, and how to deal with the likes of Saddam, because the world is full of leaders who abuse the sovereignty of the people whom they are the rulers of. And when that happens, the people do need some outside assistance to deal with their rulers. So in case of abuses, genocide, and so on, there has to be some international intervention. How to organize it? That's the third problem. There are other problems, of course, but I think these are where America ought to be leading and has a special responsibility. Now, it's going to be very difficult to regain that position, given the suspicion that now surrounds us. But that is the direction that at least needs to be articulated. And if it's successfully implemented, I think we would regain that position.
Steve Montiel, who runs our Institute for Justice and Journalism.
You talked about the role of media and the institutional role, but also the business role. I wonder if you could
Can you talk? Be sure people talk loud enough so they can be heard by all.
I wonder if you could elaborate on what you see in terms of professional responsibility of individual journalists, what you see as the limitations and the potential for an individual journalist or some group of individual journalists to have any impact or effect on the way truth is perceived. And just to elaborate for a second, Bob Scheer was one of the early journalistic voices trying to set things straight in the way that the war on terror was talked about. The criticism is that there weren't enough journalists doing that. Is there a critical mass of individual journalists who can make a difference?
I think that there is a professional responsibility that journalists do have. And it's very difficult to meet that responsibility when you also have to sort of cater to the market. But I think there is such a thing as a profession. And I think the professional values have eroded and have been replaced by market values. This is a non-market value. And that's actually one of the, say, challenges for our open society, how to maintain those professional values. And when I started my foundation's programs in the United States, actually the original sort of scope is very interesting now, because one of those was how to resolve the issue of how to protect professional values against market values. And we try to do it in the field of law, medicine, and we were thinking also of journalism. And actually, we didn't make much headway, so we never got to journalism. But we did some interesting things. The program on law became a sort of a major field of activity, but it doesn't deal too much with the professional stuff, but actually with the reform of the criminal justice system. So it's doing worthwhile things, but not the original thought. So that's my answer to you. But actually, following that on that, I'd like to mention that there were two other programs that were right there at the beginning. One was a project on death in America, because we have a fear of death, which enables us to deal with the prospect of death. And because of that, the way we deal with the dying it makes dying much harder than it ought to be. And that program was very successful, and we actually sort of phased out of it because it's now become part of the curriculum. The other was drug policy, because the war on drugs was doing more harm than drugs themselves. And so I find it sort of ironic that those two programs in particular have become extremely relevant to the war on terror, because the war on terror has many of the same attributes of as the war on drugs. And of course, the terrorists hit a particular soft spot, an Achilles heel in our psyche or in our culture, the fear of death, which could then be exploited by our leaders to mislead us or lead us in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
I'm Sharon Stewart from here at USC. Would you agree that it's a fertile fallacy that the United States was built by, that we're this, our history is this egalitarian society, when we've had to fight every step of the way for women's rights to vote, for the end of slavery, etc. But we have this fallacy in our heads that this is this great democratic government, etc. If the part of, that it is a fertile fallacy, that this is inherent in who we are, given, what we did to Native peoples, etc., etc. How important is it for us in trying to understand reality, in understanding the past? I mean, can we, in our heads, get beyond, doing what we're doing if we still have these kinds of fallacies and fantasies about, our actions and who we are?
I think we do have that ideal, and it has led us basically in a good direction. Of course, reality we didn't quite live up to we didn't live up to our ideals. So you can find many things where we have failed. I mean, but nevertheless, having that ideal has actually moved us in that direction. So thinking of ourselves as decent people is a fertile fallacy.
But if I could just push your question a little more, because your book is tougher than you're being right now. And you basically
By far.
By far, yeah. I don't know what you're pandering to the crowd here or something. Because basically in the book you say we're set up for some real disasters here. We could go the way of fascism. You say it's not, there, and we have some barriers, but that this could come. That our people are not as serious as they should be. They're not focused. We don't educate. We are easily manipulated. We have these thugs in power now who are taking us down this wrong road. It's quite dangerous. And it would seem to me that basic to that is this idea that sort of Ronald Reagan had, we're the city on the hill. We've always been the center of virtue. We're the good guys. So we screw up. So there's torture. Basically, we've got the right attitude. In your book, you say that's not enough. You say that's not enough, and you say we are set up to really be a dangerous force. I just want to quote for you. You said here, then came the election of George W. Bush in 2000, the terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. I felt that open society was endangered in the United States, not so much because of the terrorist attacks, but because of the way President Bush responded to them. So you're saying this president and his actions have put us at greater risk than the terrorists.
Yes, no. You are right, and you are right. In other words, thinking of ourselves as decent people has taken us a long way. In fact, it's been so successful that we emerged as the leading power in the world. But we didn't use our power the way that this administration wants to use it. You see, we were as powerful after the end of the Second World War as we were after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, when we emerged as a sole superpower. But we used it to establish the United Nations. We used it to introduce the Marshall Plan. And so we did actually live up to this ideal of living up to the unique responsibility of being leaders of the world. You know, Roosevelt certainly believed in it. And now we have a false conception. This administration doesn't believe in legitimacy, for instance. If this administration believes, or the ideologues in it believe that international relations are relations of power, not law. That international law is useless, that it basically just ratifies whatever power has achieved. Now, it happens to be close to the truth, but believing that destroys international law and ends up really endangering us as leaders of the world and as an open society. So we are endangered, but we have a great history.
But you say it goes beyond this administration. You say it's not just the administration, it's something in the American society,
yes.
The feel-good society. What is this?
Well, it is, I would say, two things, and it's a tentative answer, of course, because we are all groping for it. One is this the worship of success, the worshipping of success. I see it on Wall Street. You know, anybody who's made a lot of money gets a lot of respect, irrespective of how he made the money. So and that is a very unstable basis, because if this reflexivity works the way I think it does, then of course you reinforce success until you go too far, and then you reinforce it the other way, and that's how you get boom busts, and that's how public opinion goes so far in one direction and then another. We need some values other than success to guide us. So that's one thing. And the other is basically consumerism, the unwillingness to face inconvenient truths. So the lack of respect for inconvenient truths, or lack of interest. So I think those are two connected factors. And I think you're absolutely right that it is not just that our leaders have misled us, but that we have also allowed ourselves to be misled. But there's another aspect to it which would bring us to explore this sort of new idea that I'm trying to explore, that in some ways we are innocent. that people in Europe have gone through the experience of fascism, Nazism, communism, and they've been exposed to the willful manipulation of truth, propaganda, Goebbels, and so on. And so, and I've been through it, and that's why, when I heard our president say that those who are not with us are with the terrorists, you see, the alarm bells went off. Because I experienced it and I saw it in real life, in early, impressionable age, you see, how these things can work out. And I think Americans haven't really had that experience. So they are innocent in not recognizing when they are being misled.
Larry, do you want to?
I'd like to ask about another fallacy that I think hasn't been identified, whether it's fertile or not, I don't know, and that sort of gets us off of demonizing this administration, which fits the role perhaps, and that is the fallacy that we have a political opposition, that we have a political system in which real opposing points of view are contending, rather than two parties that overlap more than they differ, both supported by corporate funding and promoted by a media system that essentially performs the ritual of opposition without the reality of opposition. So, to a great extent, people who are engaged with the issues you're talking about are led by the system and the media to believe that the opposite party is in fact the answer, when the opposite party in fact is no answer. The Democrats' opposition to the war mostly says we do it better. It's not really an opposition, and I think it narrows the range to the point I think has essentially since the Second World War has curtailed it quite deliberately so as to move the energy of political participation and opposition into a channel which precludes actual change. That to me is, among the things you're talking about, is a very peculiar and particular obstacle to the changes that I think we all share with you, the desire to have happened.
Yeah. I'm also quite critical of the stance taken by most Democrats, but I think you're going too far in your criticism.
Let's watch the 2008 election.
Well, I hope things will improve by then. But you see, our democratic system is based on two parties competing for the middle ground, to get a majority and to rule. And that's the traditional way that parties function. Now, one party has been hijacked by extremists who are not going for the middle ground. They're really, I call them extremists, but maybe that's an extreme expression. Maybe I should just call them radicals. But they have a radically different view, and they are not deterred from it by public opinion. They realize that that they can impose their view if they are persistent enough, if they repeat their mantras often enough, and they can get away with it. And in fact, they did get away with it for quite. It has carried them quite far. So, from their perspective, that's a fertile fallacy that you can manipulate public opinion, and you don't need to follow public opinion, but you can lead it. But the other party is still going by the old mantra of trying to follow public opinion. So it has, one leading in a certain extreme direction or radical direction, the other one trying to catch up. So the whole political spectrum has moved very much to one side. But I think that by discrediting the direction, and this comes back to the war on terror, because that's when we left sort of near equilibrium conditions and entered into far from equilibrium conditions, this war on terror. Once we realize that that is a false metaphor, you see, I think that we will regain our sanity and the system will work again. And I think then the other party can be recaptured from the extremists. And when you look at, the stance that is being taken on this interrogation issue, you can see that there are some forces in the Republican
On
Party.
that slightly hopeful note, let me just say I promised we'd end at 1. Bob Scheer, thank you so much, Manuel Castells, and George Soros for a fascinating discussion. And I want to remind everybody that there are books. There's going to be a book signing back here, a chance to talk with Mr. Soros yourself, and thank you for honoring us by being with us today. It's great.